Timber stand improvement is probably the number one thing that most hunters and landowners overlook because they don't understand it. Improving the timber on your property probably has the most impact in not only improving the deer herd, but improving the overall quality of your hunting property to attract deer and hold deer for longer periods of time. If done correctly, it can greatly improve the property and overall deer herd. But if it's done wrong, it can really destroy your property in a very negative way. Welcome back to episode 4 in this series of how to improve your property. If you guys missed episode 1, 2, and 3, I'll drop a link down in the description below. You guys can check that out to catch up on all the episodes. In today's video, we're going to discuss the different methods that you can use and what are some negatives that landowners I see going to different properties consulting that I run across, and hopefully it can solve this issue and you guys can improve your property leading into 2025. One of the biggest things that I'm seeing is that you have a landowner or a hunter that follows their favorite YouTuber. When they follow that favorite YouTuber, that YouTuber will come out with a video and say, hey, we're going to hinge cut this property, or we're going to clear cut this property, or select cut this property. The problem with this is that just because it's your favorite YouTuber doesn't mean that that method is appropriate in your situation. It doesn't mean that that YouTuber is wrong. It just means that just because he's hinge cutting his property, it may not be the best method on your property. So starting fresh going into 2025 habitat improvement season, have an open mind and be able to understand the different methods on your property to improve your timber. That way you can have a variety of ideas going into the season, and you can improve your property, better than just having that one single mindset. We're back on the original property that I made episode 1 on. I'll also leave a link down to that. It'll be included in the playlist on improving your property. Number 1 is hinge cutting. Hinge cutting is an extremely valuable tool to use on your property to improve it. But the problem is hinge cutting is not needed on every property. And the problem with it is, again, just because it's your favorite YouTuber, guys will go out to their property to evaluate it and say, oh my God, I need to hinge cut my property, but it's the completely wrong tool to use. For an example, most properties that I go to here in Maryland, in some areas, hinge cutting is the completely wrong method to use on properties because it's a lot of mature timber. There is no smaller diameter trees for you to actually hinge cut. So then I go to the property and guys are trying to hinge cut, trees that you can freaking, bear hug and you can't even get your arms around. Not that one, but there's trees like this elm, and there's just so many trees in here that you cannot simply hinge cut. You have to have a plan when you start hinge cutting, with just like with every method, but you can't just go into an area that has a mix of larger diameter trees and then smaller diameter trees, such as 3 to 8 inches, perfect for hinge cutting. You can't just hinge cut those trees because the overhead canopy is still too large and doesn't allow the sunlight to come down to the trees that you just hinge cut. So you have to get rid of that overhead canopy first, the larger diameter trees, then you can start focusing on the hinge cutting. Those hinge cut trees need sunlight to survive. So in an area such as this, we have this tree here, which I may flush cut and get out of the way. We have this tree here that I may flush cut and get out of the way. But then you come over here, it's kind of like a live video here. You come to this tree, I may be able to hinge cut that tree on top of the trees over here that I just dropped. So you have to remove that overhead canopy first, get those out of the way, get those down on the ground to allow the sunlight to be able to penetrate those hinge cut trees, the understory trees. When you cut, you allow that sunlight to hit them, allows them to survive. Now there may be a situation on your property where it makes sense to hinge cut, where you have nothing but 3, 6, 8 inch diameter trees. That's all you have, and there's wide open timber. It may be the perfect method for you. But in those mature mixed timber areas where you have those 12, 14, 16, 18 inch trees, you have to handle those first, whether you are flush cutting them or hack and squirting them to kill the tree to allow that sunlight. Once you figure that out, then you can come back in and hinge cut the smaller diameter trees to create travel routes, certain bedding areas, etc. Some properties that I go to, the client sometimes will be like, how come we're not going to hinge cut this area? How come we're not going to do this? And immediately when they start talking, I know who they've been watching from YouTube and all the other platforms. But once I break it down for them, be like, look, man, I'm open to all methods. My mindset is not hinge cutting. My mindset is not hack and squirt. My mindset is not clear cut. And my mindset is not select cut. I'm open to all of those, but it depends what is appropriate for your land. Problem number 2 is that a lot of times you'll get an area that's really thick, right? And when that area is very thick, you drop all of these trees, right? Because you watched your favorite YouTuber cut a bunch of trees. The problem with that is when you start cutting so many trees, you create a disaster, an area that you have to come back in and clean up, because if it's too thick, the deer won't use it. That is where all the other methods come in hand. So if you're in an area, say for instance, you have a bunch of mature trees. Well, if you start cutting all those mature trees down, you create a disaster. The deer can't move through it. So instead of thinking in your mind, hey, I have to cut all the trees. No, you don't. Cut the trees that you think you need to cut to where you still have access, deer still have access to move around. Then if you still need more sunlight, then you can use other methods. You come back in, you hack and squirt some trees. Every method has a place. Each method might be appropriate for different lands, or all the methods might be appropriate for the land. Have an open mindset. Even then, I'm not coming in an area and saying, we got to take all these trees out. I have a plan in place. I want to cut trees and bed deer away from food sources. That way, I can bed those deer, say 100 to 200 to 300 yards away from my food sources. Then I can use those in between areas between the bedding and fooding, bed and food, to hunt. I can have huntable transitions that I create to hunt. I don't want that bedding right next to food. I don't want the food right next to bedding. I want that separation. That's why you don't want to go into your property and just start cutting the entire property, because then the entire property is the same. You want differences, different habitat features within that property. Cutting the timber, again, is the biggest hurdle for most landowners and deer hunters. When I go out there, it's a struggle for them. I get messages and texts all the times, and I get pictures of wide open timber. Dave, what can I do? If you don't have that open mindset to cut the timber, you're literally going to struggle the entire time that you own that piece of property. Moving into 2025, have that open mindset. Be open to all of these different methods to improve the timber. Don't focus on one just because your favorite YouTuber is a method that he uses in his area. You have to be open-minded with all of this. You'll have way better results.